Welcome to Witch Hunt. I'm Mary Bingham. In this entry, I will tell the story of Salem Witch Trial victim Sarah Wilds. Sarah Averill lived at Ipswich from the time of her family's immigration between 1634 and 1637, when she was about 8 years old, and most likely remained there until she was in her mid-30s. The Averill house was possibly considered to be comfortable, albeit a small house with probably only one room, making tight living quarters for this family of 9. The Averills were considered to be of lower class, though not destitute, and they did not live above their means. The fact that the family possessed only what was needed, coupled with tight living quarters and 2 beds for 9 people, probably led to some interesting conversations as the family navigated around each other on a daily basis. Unfortunately, it is not known about the relationships between Sarah and her 6 siblings during her younger years. But we do know that she had a loving relationship with her older brother William, as was evidenced by the way he stood up to the neighbors for her in the 1670s, and when she and her future husband signed William's last will and testament in April of 1691. Sarah, at 22 years old, was first hauled into court in November of 1649, charged with fornication with Thomas Wardall. After much research, including reaching out to the Massachusetts State Archives with no resulting information, I lost hope of ever discovering who this man was or the circumstances surrounding this charge. But we now know him to be Thomas Wardwell. But which one, as there were a couple of men living in Boston and Ipswich by that name. We cannot be 100% sure who he actually is, though the research continues. What we do know is that Sarah suffered the punishment of 10 whips at the stocks, while Thomas was nowhere to be found. In May of 1663, Sarah was brought before the Ipswich court again for wearing a scarf. It is important to reiterate that Sarah was considered to be middle to lower class and had to dress as such. For her, being seen wearing a scarf in public was considered to be excess of apparel. She was discharged and she didn't have to pay a fine. As she was single in May of that year, and both of her parents were deceased, Sarah may have lived on the family house lot, which her brother William now had charge. Sarah may have also moved to Topsfield with William and his wife, Hannah, about a year prior. In Topsfield, William's neighbor was John Wilds. John, who was then a 44-year-old carpenter in 1662, also lived in Ipswich as a young man, within 2 miles of the Averill homestead. The Wilds and the Averills probably knew each other long before Sarah and John eventually married. When John's first wife, Priscilla, died shortly after the death of their infant son, John may have felt a dire need to find someone to take care of his children for the survival of his family. And Sarah needed a husband for her own survival. After all, Sarah was then 36 years old and never married. She was possibly considered to be a lesser woman that no man would want. Luckily, John needed her, and Sarah's socioeconomic status increased significantly when they married the 23rd of November in 1663 at Topsfield. All of John's children with Priscilla were under the age of 18. His daughters, who ranged in ages from 3 to 12, were obviously still too young to run a household by themselves. Though there was a strict hierarchical structure in every aspect of the puritanical existence, one thing was certain, that the matriarch of the family basically ruled everything inside the walls of the house. In Sarah's case, as well as all healthy married women taking care of their families, she would rise at dawn and work around the clock to make sure her family was well cared for. Not only would Sarah have performed chores described earlier when she was living in Ipswich, but now she had to make sure the fire was tended first thing in the morning so that the family would be fed. Sarah also had to temper any arguments amongst family members because showing anger was considered to be a disgrace and caused great discomfort when tempers flared in such tight living space. Also of great importance was that Sarah had to take charge of her children's education, both religious and secular. The only place outside their home where a woman was supposed to work would have been the herb gardens and the fields housing the chickens and the cows. However, Sarah's case may have been slightly different. Since John was active in town affairs, he was probably away from the farm during the day quite a bit. John Wilds Jr. and Jonathan Wilds were sometimes living with their Uncle William in Ipswich before they died in the mid to late 1670s. That left Sarah to take care of the financial transactions which needed to be attended and meant she possibly had to go into the field and work alongside others on occasion. We will never know exactly the reasons for the breakdown between the Reddingtons, who lived next door, and the Wilds. In particular, we will never know why Mary Reddington seemed to despise Sarah. Maybe Mary did suffer such sorrow after her sister, Priscilla, died and felt the remarriage between her brother-in-law, John Wilds, and Sarah Averill was just too soon. Maybe Mary heard the previous rumors of Sarah's court appearances and disapproved that Sarah would be raising her sister's children. There may have been many factors contributing to Mary's dislike of her neighbor, and none of which to be Sarah's fault. The fact remained that Mary did not like Sarah and would spread stories far and wide to whomever would listen. Mary Reddington and her daughter, Mary Herrick, who lived in Beverly, took a trip so Mary Reddington could receive spiritual counseling from Reverend John Hale of Beverly. Mary related so many stories to Reverend Hale regarding Sarah bewitching her that he couldn't remember them all. However, Mary Reddington did convince John Hale of one thing. You see, years ago, Reverend Hale visited Jonathan Wilds in Ipswich to pray for him. Some of Jonathan's neighbors thought Jonathan was insane. Some thought he was possessed, while others thought Jonathan was just a big faker. After hearing Mary's stories about Sarah, Reverend Hale concluded that Jonathan was bewitched, most likely by Sarah. So now the stories about Sarah spread outside the town of Topsfield, and John got wind. Now, John did not actively file lawsuits against people, as far as I know. However, he was so angry that he walked out his door and headed west down Perkins Row to pay his neighbor, John Reddington, a visit and told him that his wife better zip it or else he would file a lawsuit. On one hand, John Reddington asked John Wilds not to file a lawsuit as his wife would be soon done telling her stories and it would be a waste to his estate. Then moments later, John Reddington said, "Besides, I don't know about anything my wife has against yours." John Wilds was not satisfied with that answer, so he left John Reddington's house and immediately headed east down Perkins Row, paying a visit to his friend and brother-in-law, William Averill. John asked William to speak to Mary Reddington. Mary told William that she didn't have anything against Sarah. Mary did not admit to her gossip when her feet were held to the fire. Another person to whom Mary Reddington complained regarding Sarah was her brother John Gould. About 1676, Mary, who was sick at this time, invited her brother to her house for the sole purpose of recording the following experience. One day, Mary and one of her brothers-in-law were traveling home from Salem via horseback. Mary felt someone, whom she later claimed to be Sarah, pull her down from her horse 2 or 3 times. Mary managed to get back up the first 2 times using all the strength that she could muster, especially after the second fall. However, the third time did not work out so well for Mary. Mary claimed Sarah pulled her down that time and held her down so that she could not get back up, though it is not clear that Sarah was actually present when Mary was pulled down from her horse. Finally, Mary's brother-in-law, as well as a neighbor, Edmund Town, eventually helped Mary Reddington back up. It's interesting that Mary's brother, John Gould, never did actually record this story at that time. Obviously, he heard Mary tell the story once or twice, saying she wanted it recorded so that the story would live on after her death. When John Gould was ready to actually write the story down, Mary became, and I quote, taken so she could not declare anything. This meant that Mary Reddington would not be able to legally prove this happened in a court of law. The story was officially recorded only during John Gould's deposition in Sarah's witchcraft case 17 years later in 1692. Another accusation that sealed the deal for Sarah was that of Deliverance Hobbs on the day both women were arrested for witchcraft in April of 1692. You see, Sarah's son, Ephraim, was the constable of Topsfield during the witch trials and was home with his father, mother, wife, and 2 young children when the Marshal of Salem, George Herrick, rode up to their door. Herrick showed the arrest warrant he carried to John, which named Sarah, and John's daughter, Sarah Bishop, and her husband, Edward Bishop Jr. George Herrick then arrested Sarah Wilds, handed the warrant to Ephraim, and instructed him to go arrest the others living in Topsfield named on the warrant, those being Mary Esty, William, and Deliverance Hobbs. Ephraim later testified that Deliverance gave him the death stare when he arrested her, which caused him to think that she accused Sarah as a witch as vengeance against him. As Ephraim was responsible for safely transporting the others arrested to Salem Village, it is most probable that he was present in the overcrowded meeting house when his mother was questioned mercilessly at the bar amongst a very noisy, dark room. Sarah declared her innocence with these words, "I am not guilty, sir. I thank God I am free." The badgering continued when a magistrate continued to harass her, saying, "Here is clear evidence that you have been not only a tormentor, but that you have caused one of these to sign the book." Sarah stood strong and replied, "I never saw the book in my life, and I never saw these persons before." No matter. Sarah was sent to the Salem jail and began a long journey around Essex and Suffolk counties due to the jail transfers from Salem to Boston, from Boston to Ipswich, and then from Ipswich back to Salem. Her husband and son took care of her by visiting her every single week, even making the 26-mile trek from Topsfield to Boston when necessary, making sure she had what she needed as she lived in a hellish atmosphere before her brutal execution on July 19th, 1692. Ephraim testified when he petitioned the court to have Sarah's attainder reversed that he and his father spoke of the detrimental economic effect of her arrest, jail time, and death had on their farm, and that Ephraim, though seeking reimbursement, knew that no amount of money could repay the loss of, in his words, so dear a friend. Thank you.